to Nairobi Comic-Con's COM-eCON 2020. My name is Les Allen from Geek XP and Icon Comics and Games Convention in South Africa. We have a global panel. I'm Australian, living in Johannesburg. We have Jason Masters, who's actually South African, living in Johannesburg. We have Phil Hester from the United States. And we have Andy Lanning from the UK. Now, Andy, do we say England or the UK?
I always get told off. I've got a friend, my very good friend is Welsh, and so I always say, I keep lumping him in as being part of England, and he really corrects me quite vociferously. So I blanket statement now, UK all the way. So,
UK all the way.
While it still carries on.
Well, this is very, very true. And Phil, Iowa, is that correct?
It's in the very middle.
It's right in the middle.
Yeah.
Excellent. And Jason, it's Johannesburg. Enough said.
Right at the bottom.
Right at the bottom. Gentlemen, thank you very much. This is the Artist Workshop panel where we're going to ask each of you a little bit about your history, how you broke into comics, the sorts of things that you as an artist found useful as you were developing your careers, and maybe some words of wisdom, a bit of guidance from anybody who might be either watching this particular presentation or listening to it. We're going to publish it as a podcast after the convention as well. So who am I going to pick on first? Andy's not paying attention. Let's go with Andy. Andy,
I was making notes.
Oh, you were making notes. Let's see. Oh, well, then I'm going to have to pick on the others because they're not being as studious. So, no, I've got Andy here. So, Andy, where did it start for you from an art perspective? Did you always draw during school as you were growing up? Give us the 30-second synopsis.
Okay, so my guess would be this is going to be a similar story with all of us, because it's I think ultimately what we do for a living is our hobby, and it's the most joyous thing in the world to do your hobby as you're living, and because exactly that, growing up in school, reading and drawing my own comic books and drawing to the point where summer holidays I would sit in front of the TV with a drawing pad watching Spider-Man cartoons, drawing to the point where my mum would shoo me outside and say, go play football, get some sunlight. And my other thing was, I also knew I really wanted to draw superhero comics. I grew up on a diet of them. It was virtually impossible trying to get hold of them, at least on a consecutive monthly basis in the UK, because they would just arrive in boxes, just blind boxes of comics, which would then get put on a spinner rack in my local newsagents. And I was vociferously, buying and reading and digesting them, and like I say, from the earliest age, just knowing this is what I want to do, and then the tricky thing came of how do you then do that? But that was that's my 30-second, sure. why I wanted to do.
Quick divergent there. I interviewed John Higgins a couple of years ago, and he talked about the boxes that came off the boat. That he wasn't even sure what American comics were going to be there. So was it a nice diet mix of UK-based comics, like the 2000 ADs, that sort of thing, and US comics?
Absolutely. And we were really lucky. We had Marvel UK titles where they would publish UK week. So we had our comics are published on a weekly basis. That's the UK comic publishing schedule. And so you'd have stories that were 7 pages or 5 pages or 3 pages that every week. So Marvel UK would take a 22-page US comic and break it up into weekly episodes that were then collected in a slightly oversized version, generally in black and white as well, and that's how we would get our US comics. But you'd have a comic that was called The Mighty World of Marvel. It might have Fantastic Four in it, Spider-Man in it, and a Hulk story, all in the same issue. And then over the course of a month, you get that month's worth of of that title. It's a very odd way. But then I was also getting the full color American versions as well. But yeah, that was definitely my my bread and butter growing up. Yeah,
that's the idea of it's a nice poo-poo of assortment of Marvel on a weekly basis. Phil, what was your first exposure to comic books? How did you realize that this could actually be something that you could do for a living?
Yeah, well, like most American kids, I got them from the local pharmacy or grocery store or bookstore. I'm pre-comic book shop by about 10 years. Uh-huh. And when I was in my teen years, comic shops started to sprout up here and there, which was incredible. But before that, it was, those normal retail outlets. But because they were those retail outlets and my only mode of transportation was a bicycle, I didn't necessarily know I would get the next issue of any comic book, like Andy was saying. You didn't know. And I was reading a really engaging issue of Iron Man, where Iron Man was thrown off the helicarrier without his armor. He had his armor in his briefcase, and he had to put it on before he hit the ground. And that was the cliffhanger. And I didn't know if I would get the cliffhanger. So I always like to write, I always like to draw. So I wrote my own ending, to sort of have peace of mind about how that would go.
How did Tony get out of it? What did he do?
Just exactly the way he did in the comic book that came out a month later. So I thought, there are people doing what I'm doing right now, but doing it for a living. And those names at the front of the comic started to make sense to me. And I thought, well, maybe I can be one of those people, especially the names I kept seeing over and over again, like Jack Kirby or John Buscema. And I thought, well, maybe I can be one of those people. And I just started making my own comics, throughout junior high and high school. I had a group of like-minded friends who liked comics as well. And we pretended to have a publishing company. We had a line of books. We had deadlines. We wrote each other about missing deadlines, and we tried to replicate that publishing experience. And it was really fantastic training for moving on to college and art school, and then sort of starting to get work while I was in art school.
That's an incredible, it's a bullpen. It's a pre-bullpen that you were.
Oh yeah.
How?
Well, part of the problem was we had a copy of Steranko's History of Comics in our school library, and there's this long romantic ode to what working in the golden age was like in the studio system and the shop system, and also these grand tales of how Bill Everett and Carl Burgos and Mickey Spillane would pile into a hotel room and bash out an issue of Namor versus Human Torch.
Wow! And
so we had these very romantic notions about what being a comic book artist was like, and the kind of demands and rigors that put upon you. And we weren't disillusioned by those sort of things. We were encouraged by them. We wanted those hard knocks. We wanted to be part of that.
That's incredibly higher grade, and there's going to be a number of points I want to come back to on that. But Jason, what was your first exposure to comic books, and when did you think you could make these funny pictures potentially make you make money?
Well, I think I initially saw comic books in.
We have a cat.
Yeah, sorry.
Cat alert.
I was muting because he was purring so loudly. I'm going to put him down. Go away, boy. I always loved to draw, and as a young kid, and then I remember going into a corner cafe with my my mom and my sister when I was very, very young and seeing like a spinner rack full of comic books there. And I was saying, oh, but you could make money doing this thing that I like to do for myself anyway. People buy these. And we had a very similar situation with comics there. Like we would never know what we'd get when I was a kid before, you know, I discovered comic book shops and central news agents and so on. And I would get things like radioactive black-route hamsters and then an ARB issue of 2000 AD and Devil Dinosaur. And it was just like, wow, there's so many ideas on just this one rack. It just immediately like gripped me. I just wanted to, you know, make comics ever since.
This, from the three of you, this all sounds like it was an easy path into comics. I found them as a kid, I started drawing, and now I publish comic books. Andy, it can't have been that simple. What were you doing from an art training perspective? When did you figure out that you needed to start developing skills?
So I the English education system is you do what were called O levels when you're in 15, 16, then you go on to your higher education, which is A levels, and then you go to university or college. I did art all the way through that. I remember one telling day was sitting down with the careers teacher. And it was like, so what do you want to do? And I said, I want to draw comic books. And the guy sort of just stared at me because it was like most of the kids were like, I want to be a banker, I want to go in the army, I want to be a policeman. I want to draw. Not even then though. I said I want to draw comic books and I want to go to the Joe Kubert School of Comic Art because I had seen the adverts in the comics. Right. And it was like, I want to go there. It was like, I want to do that. And the guy was like, and I'm like looking at him like, help me do this. And he didn't have a clue, you know, it was, so he basically said to me, you know, you just, you know, go to art college. So I applied to go to art college to do a degree in fine art, got turned down for that because my portfolio was just full of comic art. And it was like, but in the end, what happened was I was very, very lucky. I actually ended up doing what was more of a vocational course, and it was like a two by 2 year course, but where you were taught by people who were working professionals. So it was, and so I got to do typography, printing. You know, I did like a massive training in all sorts of disciplines. But more importantly, I had a couple of really good tutors. One guy who was the illustrator of, forgive me on this one, of the Joy of Sex book, but who just had just the most beautiful illustrative style, but who was just, you know, just a fantastic draftsman. And the other guy who taught us life drawing class, who was a storyboard artist. And so it was like I leached as much information off them as possible, and I learnt. By that time, you know, I was in like 18 or 19, I learned that to actually go to the Kubert School of Art, I would have to pay my own way over there, pay foreign student fees and everything. And I'm from like a working class family, you know, and it was thousands of pounds. And I was like, right, okay, that dream's not going to happen, I'm afraid. But right. I was very lucky, and John Higgins may have mentioned this if you spoke to him, is I learned that there was a thing in the UK called the Society of Comic Strip Illustrators. And it was like, what, these there's more people like me, I would they met on the first Thursday of every month. I would get a train from it's like a 30-minute train journey into London from where I was at college, and I used to just turn up hours before anyone else and just wait till the meeting started, and they would let me in and just let me sit in the side room while I had their meetings and stuff like this. In the end, I ended up tending bar for them because I was always there. It was like, but that's where I got to meet people like John Higgins, like David Lloyd, like Dave Gibbons, and people like that, you know, and suddenly, what I thought was a very narrow worldview about what I was doing, because it was just, again, me scribbling away with my friends and trying to suddenly opened out, and there were, through talking to those people, I learned of connections and things like that. And I got my first paid comic gig in my last year of college. Which was, I drew Boy George's life story for a comic magazine over here, and I've got one of the pages of artwork over here, which I had to buy back from an art dealer, and it was like, I did. It's just such a funny thing. I saw it online. I was like, I'm going to buy that back. It's my first page of published artwork, and my wife said to me, "Can't you just tell him who you are? And would he not just keep on saying, you don't know how this works?"
It sounds like you stumbled on like the secret society of comic book art.
Seriously, it was in a place in Tite Street in London, and it's
don't reveal the location. You can't.
Oh no, seriously, yeah. They don't do it anymore. It's gone now. It's all gone. But it was a club where Oscar Wilde used to go and things like this. It's actually mentioned. The address is mentioned in a Monty Python sketch. There's this famous Monty Python sketch about Oscar Wilde, which mentions the place where the SSI would have their meetings. No, it was amazing, and like I say, just by I tenaciously just turned up every single Thursday until they basically took pity on me and let me join in. But I got to meet people like Glenn Fabry and Liam Sharp there, and Neil Gaiman tended bar after me. I passed my barman's napkin over to Neil.
I think Phil, I think Andy's taken the lead with origin stories.
Oh, yeah.
Please tell me about all the secret societies in Iowa, particularly comic book society.
You're looking at it.
You're it?
Yeah. We're United States is very spread out, as you know, and so the scenes sort of revolve around bigger metropolises. So there's a scene in Minneapolis north of me, a scene in Kansas City south of me, Chicago. So the bigger towns have scenes, but and the state of Iowa, even though it's 3 million people, there are just a handful of people drawing comics or even wanting to draw comics. Right. And eventually I did get to know them all, but mostly after I'd become a professional.
Mm-hmm. You described having the bullpen type experience that you and your friends put pressure on yourselves to make sure you had deadlines. All of those skills are vital to be able to perform in the comic book industry. Your technical skills, what did you do to develop those further?
Well, I put myself on this kind of, I'm very undisciplined in the rest of my life. But when it comes to art, I put myself on this regimen that I would submit to Marvel and DC Comics every 6 months throughout high school. And I was so far away. I was terrible. I wasn't even close. But back then, Marvel and DC actually responded to cold submissions, and they would write back to you and give you pointers. And I had this wall, a bulletin board that was like, 4 inches thick of rejection letters from Marvel and DC, but they all had little tidbits about how I could improve. Mm-hmm. And I kept that regimen up through college. I got good enough grades to go to university on an academic scholarship, but I was really there for art. And I pursued a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. But luckily, while I was there, I will say that training was useful because for the most part, I spent probably 3 hours a day drawing from the model, which if you want to draw comic books, you have to have a vocabulary of the human figure in your mind. And life drawing 3 hours a day will put that in your mind. You'll get one. And I was lucky that during that intensive life drawing training, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles dropped. And overnight, the number of little publishers exploded, like people wanting to replicate that Turtles, success. Right. And so pretty much anyone with a credit card decided they were a publisher. And suddenly the bar to cross to be a professional comic book artist was very low. And between my sophomore and junior years of college, I started to get work. And when I was in college, that seemed incredible to me. You know, I was getting like $30 a page, but you know, to a college student, that's magic. And I started working on a lot of really regrettable comics at that time. And when I find them at conventions, I buy them and destroy them.
What was the worst idea, Phil? What was the worst idea?
At that time, I broke in. I've always been writing and drawing comics my whole, you know, ever since I was a kid. But I broke in as an artist, and I would say the one that I'm most embarrassed by is a comic book called Port, and that's apostrophe P-O-R-T, which is short for teleport, which was about a character who could teleport. And it wasn't that it was just a terrible, you know, reprehensible idea, is that everybody involved with it were sort of at my beginner level of talent. So it was sort of all our, you know, everybody got to see our first efforts, which was, you know, embarrassing, of course. But of course, that's the one comic book my father had framed and put in the foyer of his home, like that's my very first comic. Yeah, I think I was at a panel around that same time at San Diego, and Will Eisner was on that panel. And the panel in general was running down the black and white explosion. It was just deriding the dreck that was coming out of the black and white explosion. And Will Eisner kind of stood up for people like me. He was like, look, this is the first generation that's having their very first efforts put out there since the Golden Age. Like, since the Golden Age, this is the first generation of cartoonists that we're going to have watch from their baby steps all the way through their full formation. So have a little pity on these guys. And right. Of course, a halo appeared behind him at that time also. But I worshipped Will from that moment forward.
All right. That's an incredible story as well. I'm going to move to Jason, but there's a consistent theme, and I've spoken to Jason before. Jason must hate the fact that I interview him so often.
No.
What's your, Jason, your quick skills development story? Because there's something I want to ask each of you, because it looks like there's a common thread. Jason, what was your growth in your technical abilities?
Well, I'd also actually seen the ads for the Joe Kubert School and was like completely blown away by it and mailed them. I managed to get into the school, did a phone interview and everything, had to do a portfolio which I had to send. But I was going to be financed because also working class family. Couldn't afford those crazy fees, especially with our exchange rate, which was still good at that stage. And then I got in, and then basically a month before I was supposed to go, the financing for it fell through, so I went into graphic design.
Right.
We had a lot of life drawing, thankfully, which helped a lot, and I kind of got a love for design there as well, and illustration. But we also did a lot of fun things like ceramics and sculptures and crazy things like that. But when I was done there, I went straight into advertising and didn't really love it. I enjoyed the crazy people that I was working with, but besides doing storyboards and coming up with stupid ad ideas, there was not really much else there for me. Entirely too many people in studios doing too many drugs.
Right. So what I'm going to do a quick fire with each of you, because I think, Jason, you've just said a lot of life drawings. And Phil, you've said 3 hours a day on life drawings. You've all had some form of formal training as far as artwork is concerned. For someone who does not have formal access, especially in today's day and age where they might have access to the internet, what are the things that somebody could do to be better at the key skills you would need for art in the comic book industry? Andy, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah. So I think life drawing is pretty much essential because, as Phil said, an understanding of the human form and being able to draw it is really the starting point for any sort of art like that. And if you haven't got access to go to life drawing classes, there are now you can actually go online, and there are life drawing sessions online where you can they'll post a 30-second pose, a minute pose, a 20-minute pose, and things like that. So you can actually do online life drawing now, which is something I actually want to get back into. I used to absolutely love life drawing, particularly because we used to do them on giant pieces of paper with charcoal, and it's just so liberating drawing, like just this big mess of stuff that you could do, which as you get, and I don't know if you guys agree with this, but as you get more and more anal doing the comic stuff, seems to get tighter and tighter and smaller, whereas the life drawing side of stuff was just like, I'm doing this because it's kind of like, it's a lot more freer, and it's all about form. But I think, on the life drawing side, go seek out life drawing, and there are some wonderful books about life drawing, things like Burne Hogarth's dynamic range of books, dynamic figure drawing, dynamic light and shade, and things like that, which begin to focus that more formal stuff into something that is a bit more illustrative and actually gives you a little bit more distortion of form and things like that.
Excellent. Bill, I saw you nodding as Andy was gesticulating about life drawing. Is this key?
I think so. Like I said earlier, you have to have that vocabulary of how a human body works in your mind, because you've got to self-generate so much imagery as a comic book artist. You can't reference everything. You've got to pull it from your imagination, but your imagination also has to be fueled by the reality that you remember from drawing from figures. I would say that in the realm of figure drawing, everything Andy said was right. I would also add the books of George Bridgman, if you want to look at George Bridgman. He's a little bit more about the rhythms of the figure rather than the fine details, but he's the best guy to look at for gesture and weight in a figure. I would also recommend you start, if you're an amateur, to start keeping a sketchbook and draw in that sketchbook not only your flights to fancy that you have, but also everyday objects that you encounter, because you will be surprised by how vanishingly small the amount of a comic book that is punch-ups. That's what we wanted to draw when we were 13, but it's usually about 4 or 5% of a comic book. The rest of it is people talking on phones, people driving cars, people changing a baby's diaper, things that you would not think to draw. In fact, that terrible comic that I first mentioned, Port, it had a baby in it, and I was 18. I'd never drawn a baby before. It had a train in it. I'd never drawn a train. So if you can, keep a sketchbook where you draw things that you don't want to draw. Take your medicine. Because you're going to have to if you make it as a comic book artist, you're going to have to take your medicine on the page. And that's not as fun as taking it in the sketchbook.
I had the good fortune to interview Brian Stelfreeze a couple of years ago, and he mentioned he struggled with hands, and his father had a military background, and said, fine, I don't want to see you drawing anything but hands for the next 6 months. And so taking your medicine, I think that's probably a really good advice. You've got to do this. Jason, what do you need to be diligent about in developing your skills, and how can we do this easily? Well, I think easily, not meaning that the comic book art is easy, but what are the easy steps that we can do to get better?
I think get over the fact that sometimes drawing is hard. It's not always fun. It seems like a lot of fun, but it's an incredible amount of work. But also the world we live in right now, the resources are all out there. The Andrew Loomis books are also out there. I think you can get them as free downloads. I'm not sure if Andy and Phil enjoy those books, but I myself learned quite a bit. And also just YouTube has tons of people teaching people how to draw all the time. There's incredible amounts of resources there.
Okay, so there's especially those free links you were talking about. We'll make sure that they get included with that video. All right, so we are coming up to the last couple of minutes, gentlemen. This has been great, and I wish we could do this for more time than you probably want to, because I'm enjoying myself immensely. Andy, 2 quick questions. It's going to be the same questions to each of you. Andy, is perfection the enemy of done?
Yeah, yes, I know. It's. I tell you what is a great antidote to perfection is the enemy of done is a deadline. A deadline cuts through that crap pretty quickly and does focus the mind. If you're working on a monthly comic book, you may have these aspirations to be a perfectionist, but I'm sure your publisher will appreciate done so much more. Excellent.
Phil, would you agree?
Oh yeah, and like Andy said, the clock will be your disciplinarian. And overall, in general, you have to learn when to let a drawing go when you start getting diminishing returns on something that you're working on. Sometimes you just have to let it go, and that's something that your skill actually diminishes over age with. I find this with cartoonists as they get older, they start becoming more perfectionist, and that's something you have to guard against. I remember when I was a kid, I would let anything go out the door because it was done, and that's something I've got to fight as I get older. I want to have everything nailed down.
Gotcha. Jason, 20 seconds. Is perfection the enemy of done?
Absolutely, but the problem is when you do send those pages out, you have to see them on the shelf. And that always kills you, especially if you know you're going to fix something. You have to look.
Not if Phil gets his way, he's burning them all.
Well, I've got a few issues like that myself.
Excellent. Gentlemen, I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us at NAICCON 2020 COM-eCON.